Final Fantasy VII saw 3 distinct releases for the Black Label, but only one of them can be considered the first print. Which one do you own? As always, make sure to hit the like button down below, and together we can defeat the YouTube algorithm. I don't think there's any debate when I say Final Fantasy VII is one of the greatest games ever released. And it's also a very collectible game. However, not all Final Fantasy VII Black Labels are made equal. In this video, I'm going to go over the 3 distinct releases for Final Fantasy VII. These all apply to the Black Label copies, so you'll be surprised to know that even within the Black Label, there's actually 3 variants, and only one of them is the first print. Let's get into it. The first variant we're going to look at, and this is actually the first print release of Final Fantasy VII, is commonly referred to as the Realistic Violence variant. And this refers to the ESRB rating on the back of the game, only containing the phrase Realistic Violence when describing what's in the game. You can also see that the I in Masterpiece is not floating. There is no misprint on this copy. That was actually done on the later printing of the game. Now, this Realistic Violence misprint can actually be found pretty commonly as a complete in-box game. However, when you get into the factory sealed market for this game, the Realistic Violence copy is actually pretty difficult to find. At this point in time, it kind of commands the same premium as the Floating Eye Masterpiece version, and that's because of how renowned that copy is. So even though Realistic Violence is the first print, a lot of people still have much more connection or fondness to the Floating Eye Masterpiece era than they do this first print nuance. And that brings me to the second printing of this game, which is the Floating Eye Masterpiece error. Now, as far as video game typos and errors go, this is probably the most notorious one. If you're not aware, the Masterpiece Floating Eye error refers to the word masterpiece on the back of the game having the eye floating above the word. This error was done somewhere in the printing. For whatever reason, the alignment did not work. As such, we got one of the most notorious typos ever. Also, on this version of Final Fantasy VII, if you look at the back ESRB rating, instead of it now saying Realistic Violence, they updated it to say Comic Mischief, Mild Animated Violence, and Mild Language, which is a far better description of what is actually in the game rather than just saying Realistic Violence. If we go back to circa 2010, when Final Fantasy VII had the highest demand I think it's ever had, the Floating Eye Masterpiece version was seen as the grail of Final Fantasy VII. Absolutely no one was collecting the Realistic Violence first print at that time. As far as anyone was concerned, the Floating Eye Masterpiece version was the first print, because it would make sense that if they made an error, they would then correct it in subsequent printings. Which they did, but prior to the Eye, you had the Realistic Violence release. And really, looking at it still today, this is the one that most collectors want. Most people even think it's the first print of the game, which I don't blame them. There's not much information out there to help collectors discern the different variations, but hopefully moving forward now, with WATA Games designating the proper releases, as well as this knowledge becoming more widespread, people will begin to call the proper versions the proper variations. With all that said, there is still one more variant to look at, and this would be the third printing of Final Fantasy VII. It doesn't really have a commonly used name, but for all intents and purposes, it is the corrected version. When you look at it, you can see that the I in Masterpiece is now in line with the rest of the text, and the ESRB rating is maintained from the second printing. This print is the least desirable of the 3 copies. I'm not sure how its relative rarity compares to the other 2, but there's really no one out there looking for this version specifically. Most people fail to discern this version from the Realistic Violence version, as the Masterpiece version is the only one that really gained notoriety amongst collectors. This version would have been the third printing of the game right before the Greatest Hits release, so it's fair to assume that the print numbers on this one might not have been as large as the first 2 releases, right when the hysteria was really peaking. However, without any kind of real demand, it floats around commonly and can be found on eBay easy enough if you just look at the back of photos. And that's it. Those are the different versions of Final Fantasy VII Black Label. Now I want you to go check your collection and let me know down below which version you have of the game. I personally own the Masterpiece version factory sealed. It wasn't the one I was looking for. My preference goes to Realistic Violence, but sometimes it just works out that way. If you like this kind of video, make sure to hit the like button down below. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.